is Indian country today?
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalohungba. Alaska Native corporations will not get a part of the $8 billion CARES Act relief funds for now. A federal judge's ruling will allow the Treasury Department to start sending checks to tribes, but doesn't actually stop the Treasury Department from also sending funds to Alaska Native corporations. 20 tribes, including some from Alaska, filed a lawsuit last week. They argued the corporations should not get the relief funds because they are not tribes and do not have a government to government relationship with the United States. The Alaska Native corporations maintain they are tribes as defined under the Indian Self-Determination Act. It's unclear how the Treasury Department will decide how much money each tribe will receive. Also unclear is how much of the $8 billion will be set aside in the event the Treasury Department decides to appeal to get some of those funds for the Alaska Native corporations. And according to a Harvard study, the $8 billion is only 10% of the total need in Indian country. The deadline is being extended for a grant that will help tribes expand broadband coverage. The Department of Interior says June 15th is the new deadline for tribes to apply for funding. Grant recipients will study the feasibility of deploying or expanding high-speed internet on tribal nations. According to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the intent is to spur economic growth, educational opportunities, and meet emergency and law enforcement needs. Help is coming from the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma in the form of K995 masks. Some 2,500 face coverings are being provided to first responders in 14 counties around the Cherokee Nation. And they are sending 5,000 face coverings to the Navajo Nation for first responders there. Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskins Jr. says, quote, "We do this because as Cherokees, we know the importance of lending a helping hand. In times of uncertainty, we will get through this as long as we remember that we are all in this together." Indian country is still finding its way through this pandemic. For the latest numbers, let's go to Jordan Bennett Begay, our Washington editor. Jordan?
Yate Patty, Yate Shikis do Shidinee. So we crunched the numbers and called people and made sure that we didn't double count these cases. So as of last night, there are a total of 2,592 positive confirmed cases and 88 deaths within the Indian health system. Again, that's 2,592 cases and 88 deaths. But Navajo did see an increase of 53 new cases. They didn't have any deaths. Ho-Chunk had 4 more new cases. The Blackfeet Nation actually had their first case up in Montana now, and so they're trying to implement measures to protect their community members. And White Mountain Apache actually, yesterday when we reported they had 98 cases, we did confirm with them, and they also did say that they have more cases now. And the White Mountain Apache tribe has a total of 111 cases, and these do include the cases at their corrections department with their correctional officers and their incarcerated individuals. And then actually the Tono O'odham Nation there in Arizona now has 25 cases and 3 deaths within their community.
That's a huge increase. And also yesterday, the Hopi tribe in Arizona, my tribe, confirmed that there were 2 tribal members who passed away from the coronavirus. So we're seeing that really take an impact on all of our tribal nations across the country. For some of these tribes, are they starting to do contact tracing? Do we know that?
Right now, we don't know that. I mean, there were, I guess, like words about Navajo already doing that. But I think, as you heard, like Virginia Hendricks said yesterday in California that they started to, but they stopped. So there's the question, like, why did they stop now? And actually, the former CDC director, Tom Friedman, did say that they need contact tracing to be able to, help track where these cases are going and to figure out where it's going to be in the future. Right now, and he has a predicted number of thousands of contact tracers that are needed. But the question is, how is Indian country going to hire these? Where's that money going to come from? And who are they going to get to fill these positions within their tribal communities?
And that's all to trace back to where the people who are tested positive, who they came in contact with. and then they can alert those people so they're aware in the event they become sick as well.
Yes, and that's what Dean Seneca, who worked with the CDC for almost 20 years, he was saying this is part of the active surveillance. When there's two different types of surveillance, there's passive, where it's just reporting the number of cases that's already happened. The active surveillance is, being proactive and looking ahead
Right.
to the future.
All right. Okay, Jordan Ben Begay, thank you so much. And we'll be right back. Welcome back. Michael Bird joins us today, and he has more than 25 years of experience in public health. He is the Public Health Program Director for the Indian Health Council based in Southern California. Welcome to our program, Michael.
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you.
You have more than 25 years of experience. Did anything in your education and your experience prepare you for this pandemic?
Well, I think general public health principles and the background in education was helpful in terms of being aware of the nature and extent of infectious disease, and also public health approaches to dealing with epidemics and pandemics. But I think probably more importantly for me really was I'm a student of history, of American history, and I'm really well versed on the impact that infectious disease has had specifically on native populations, on both in North and South America. And if there's any population, any community who really knows or should be really aware of the impact that infectious disease can have upon an indigenous native population, it clearly is the American Indian population. We've been dealing with every infectious disease that came from Europe for over 500 years, and they range everywhere from syphilis to smallpox. You name it. And native communities have had to deal with infectious disease, and it clearly impacted. There are tribes that through contact were infected, and because we were considered sort of a virgin population, we had no natural immunity to many of the diseases that had been widespread in Europe. And so those populations could deal with to some extent, respond better because they had been exposed previously, whereas our communities had not been exposed to many of these diseases. And it needless to say, it reduced our numbers significantly. And so it's not, if you understand the nature of what happened with Native people, this is not new. We've been dealing with infectious diseases like from day one, once Europeans set foot on this.
Are we dealing with it, or are we reacting to it?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. I think that we have had to, in order to survive, and the fact that we are still here, I think we have had to probably attempt to identify those things that allowed us to continue to survive. And we, it's been a combination of disease and warfare and genocide and removal. All of these things have impacted our communities. And I think if there's a lesson to be learned for the general population, for other communities, there are some lessons I think to be learned. And I think the lessons have to do with what is how do we survive, and what was the key to our survival? And I think the key to our survival was to some extent being able to isolate, and that's much harder nowadays because everything is connected. We're part of a global community, and even in rural communities, even in frontier communities, even reservation communities, there's really the ability to separate yourself and isolate yourself is much more challenging than it's ever been.
That is so going up in our stories that we're reporting with tribes that you would think are in remote areas but are being impacted. So being in a remote area doesn't matter anymore because, again, people travel around so much. What about data collection? What about how Indian Health Services collects data, contract health units also collect that data, but there is not any kind of shared information. And then you bring in groups like yourself, with an urban Indian population serving a medical center serving people living in the urban areas. How are you collecting data, and are you reporting that back to tribes when one of its tribal members gets sick or passes away from the coronavirus?
Well, let me say, first of all, we serve a rural reservation community. We are not an urban center, and we are in some ways an isolated area, which I think is to the community's benefit. And one of the things that I've been impressed by here is that the health board that provides the direction to the health center really is very much interested in the work that we do and in our data, who we're serving, how well we're serving them. So, I can speak to this experience here since January, and they're very interested and very concerned with they were always concerned, but are even more concerned now as to who are we serving, are we meeting the needs of the patients and the community members, and I would have to say that the response here has been remarkable. I've just been totally impressed with the leadership in the health center. We have an incident command team that is overseeing our response to COVID and ensuring the security and safety of our patients and the community. I would have to say, in terms of data systems, and this is my response is going to be a larger response is in general, but I think one of the things we clearly are aware of is the fact that the Indian Health Service has been funded historically at the 50% of the level of need. We also are aware of the fact that more funding per capita goes to the care of federal prisoners than to Indian people. And this has been validated in two reports that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights did. A recent report was last year, and then one that I was involved in was about 10 years ago, which the study indicated that there just was not adequate resource. So here, I guess the point is that we've never been adequately resourced, in spite of the fact the United States government made a commitment to Native tribes to meet our needs through treaties, executive orders, and we still only have 50 to 60% of resources. So when you have an epidemic, a pandemic of this nature impacting our communities, we're scrambling, all of us are scrambling, because other communities, you see major cities who are having a hard time dealing with this, who have more resources than our communities. And so what impacts them to the manner that it has is doubly more difficult and more challenging, because we're still behind the curve in terms of we've never been resourced to meet the needs prior to this COVID, and now we're having to respond to not only the ongoing needs, but COVID on top of everything else. So you want to talk about a full plate, and providers and systems that definitely are stressed. I can say, we are, our health center, the workload has increased because of ICE needing to work remotely. That's a new challenge, but I can't speak for anybody else, but my sense is that I think many of our Indian communities this is not, responding to crisis is not new, unfortunately. We probably train some people in terms of how to respond to crisis, because we've been dealing with these kinds of inadequate funding, inadequate resources, and trying to meet the needs of communities that are already at risk because of diabetes and some of the conditions that we're dealing with day to day.
Let's connect the dots and understand, why is it, Congress is the one that appropriates the funding for Indian healthcare. So let's connect the dots in terms of what is happening that is creating this environment where Congress is not fully funding healthcare for American Indians and Alaska Natives.
It really goes back to, I think, political will. The United States government has made many commitments to many nations, and sees them as valuable and important to the national security and national well-being. Well, they also made commitments and promises to Native people, and Native people are still waiting for those promises to be fulfilled. I would say to you that, and to everyone, that if you really want to secure this nation, one of the things you can do is ensuring that you keep your promises to Native people. And Native people, we all know this, in addition to everything else, serve the highest rate of military service is the Native community. And yet our Native veterans are serving and have served in every major engagement in terms of foreign engagement, and then come home to their home communities and cannot get they cannot get, and their families cannot get the services that they need equal to the general public, the general population. We believe in securing this nation, but I think that we spend millions of dollars for military defense, but don't invest in the infrastructure and public health infrastructure, public health housing, public health systems, public and transit systems, education systems. Those are a real investment in securing and making this nation strong. Yes, you have to have military. Yes, that's a requirement. But a nation is only as strong as its people, and if you invest in your people and in Indian people specifically, I think then you're going to have a stronger, better nation, and we have not done that. When it comes to public health, nobody was talking about public health pre-COVID, except those people who work in infectious disease and those people who work in public health day in and day out. But nobody was uttering public health. Wasn't on the lips of the majority of people in this country.
How does voting play a part in this?
Well, it's the only way that we have to express our intent and our desire, and to create the future that we desire. There is structural impediment. It's the structures that are in place, that are represented by our politicians, by our government, and we have to make a decision who really is committed to our community, who really shows up day in and day out and is creating structures and opening things up and investing in our communities to ensure that we have clean air, clean water, clean land, and public health resources, and health education, and education resources, and housing resources. If people aren't, we need to educate ourselves and make sure that people are committed to us and to our communities, and supporting them, and making sure it's not, a long time ago I figured out it's really not about what people say, it's about what they do. And
well, that's true with the two women representatives in Congress now, Deb Haaland and also Sharice Davids, really leading that fight to include tribes in the CARES package, and then going back and fighting for casinos with fewer than 500 employees to have a part of that payment protection plan. So I'm just trying to connect these dots, for people watching. How does the system work, and how can Indian people be a part of that more effectively?
Well, kudos to Deb and Sharice for the work that they're doing, because one of the things in this country that clearly, in my experience in public health and in general, is that Indian people are largely invisible. People don't see us, they don't know us, they don't interact with us. And for some people, I think that creates a level of comfort, because they don't really have to, treaties, what does that mean? Who cares, they really don't understand what that means for our communities. And being invisible People don't feel like they need to respond to our needs because they don't hear from us, they don't see us. It's a lot easier to ignore us than other communities who have representation, who are larger in number. And sometimes, quite frankly, even some of those communities are not as could be more helpful. I think that we need to really understand that we all share a common, in many ways, we have more in common when you're disenfranchised on the outside than when you're on the inside, and recognizing that we need to build coalition, we need to have communication, we need to share our stories, because our stories are stories of survival, our stories are stories of struggle, and our stories are very similar. And until we recognize those things that we have in common, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to change those systems that in fact need to be changed, because there are structural changes that need to occur. Racism is still prevalent and needs to.
Well, when you bring up race, that's another point to make for non-Native people. American Indians, Alaska Natives are not simply a racial group of people. We are political entities, which I think a lot of people don't quite understand. So, we are a political body. Let me switch topics and just try to make some correlations. You were at the forefront of a lot of work when AIDS first came out, and HIV. Do you see any correlations between that health scare and how people handled it, and then eventually how it kind of became more, there was more understanding about HIV? Do you see any correlations between that and this coronavirus pandemic?
Well, clearly there's, infectious disease as it manifests itself. What it did initially, early on with HIV and AIDS was, people were frightened, just like they're frightened now, because they didn't know how it was spread, they didn't know who was at risk, and they didn't know the nature of the extent of how contagious it was. So people were kind of, not embracing and not open to being sometimes supportive of communities and of individuals who were infected. So I think that there are some parallels. I'm sure there's some lessons we could learn from that. And I guess, again, I would say when I was the director of the National Native American AIDS Prevention Center, it was not, even in the AIDS community, not everybody necessarily was interested in responding to our community in the same way that they were open and willing to engage other communities of color. And I can say that as a fact. And in some cases back then, and I hope, some folks in government agencies and state agencies are recognizing the fact American Indian people are still here, and we have needs just like everyone else. And unless we are invited to participate in not just as recipients of care, but in terms of governance, in terms of elected officials, and in terms of board representatives, be it public health agencies, be it public health departments, not just Native communities, but the non-Native community. And I think some of us from the Native community need to do more work to really reach out and engage those partners. But those partners also have to be open to recognizing you can't just talk about diversity and equity and social justice. You have to practice it. Some folks, their idea of diversity is about this wide. It means my community, my home, my group. Diversity, when you talk about diversity, it's not a narrow thing. It has to be inclusive and broad and involve everyone. And I've often said that if there's one population that continually is left out, in spite of our special relationship with the government, and the government does a little better job, but some of the nonprofits, some of the external entities, one of the questions they need to ask themselves when they bring their board of directors together, when they bring whoever is running their company, their foundation, they need to look around the room, and the first question they need to ask themselves, who's not here? And I can tell you from my experience, in many places, even to this day, the people who are not there are Native people. There is Native representation. People can be talking about equity, diversity, and social justice, and you might see representation from other communities. But I'll put money on the table that in many cases those entities have no Native representation and have made little to no effort to engage us when they fail to understand that they reside and on Native land in many cases, and in many institutions, including a number of universities across this country. There was a wonderful article that came out of Colorado, I'm forgetting the reference, but how Berkeley and many other institutions have benefited from Native land, have created endowments,
That's a whole different topic there, but that's a good
but
point.
it's
If you're
connected.
not at the table, you're on the menu. That's as a saying.
And some people call it Thanksgiving.
Michael Bird, thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate the work that you all do. You create visibility, and that is extremely important.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Thalahongva. Thanks for joining us.
This is Indian Country Today.